it was kind of like an imperial goal of Tsarist Russia to re-establish the Byzantine Empire, to take back that territory that the Byzantine lost to the Ottomans. All right, to kind of Christianize Eastern Europe again, because there was a lot of Ottoman rule in this time. This was pretty much unacceptable to the British because at this point, right, Britain had pretty much a hegemony over a lot of key areas of North Africa, including Egypt and the Suez Canal, which was like a big cash cow for them. The biggest cash cows for the British Empire were, as you know, the subcontinent and the Suez Canal. Now, the issue with the Russians establishing themselves in Turkey, modern day Turkey, would be that they could challenge the British in the Mediterranean. They could
Mhm.
challenge the British in North America. I mean, North Africa, right?
It becomes a base for them to operate out of.
It gives a launching pad for them to operate out of. There were many instances in where the Ottomans, I mean, the Russians basically had the Ottomans on the brinks of collapse, and it was the British who would prop them up. There was this
Mhm.
one incident where there was a reported massacre of a lot of Christian uh, people in the Ottoman Empire, right? And the rest of the entire like Christian world in Western Europe was up in arms against this, especially Russia. And Russia saw it as a great pretext to launch another campaign, right? Queen Victoria writes to Benjamin Disraeli that these guys are a bunch of sentimental fools. This has got nothing to do with Christianity. These people aren't even Christians. These Russians aren't even Christians.
Okay.
It's not a question of Christian versus Muslim. It's a question of British or Russian hegemony. And for that answer, it's always British. So
Hmm.
Britain wasn't operating from any place of sentimentality, any place of, Christian civilization or anything. They looked at the calculus very, very simply. It's either us or Russia. Periphery island, philandering in the region like they've always kind of done, right? So that's kind of the context of where we find the great game being playing. Germany is the enemy in Europe. Russia is the enemy in Asia for the British.
And which is why, if I recall correctly, a lot of theorists say the biggest nightmare for Britain and the Allies was the prospect of Germany and Russia ever coming together. Or the typical European aristocracy, the leading countries, their biggest fear is Russia and Germany coming together.
Uh, a big part of it, yeah. The French and the British for sure. So the Germans and the Russians, right? They were natural allies. They shared a lot of the same civilizational values for a part. I mean, of course, you have the Germanic people and the Slavic people who were two different people altogether, but there were a lot of ties, right? Most of the Russian aristocracy were Prussian. I believe it was what was that city? I'm forgetting the name. That became where even Kant was from, bro. There used to be a German city that became a Russian one after
Oh,
World War One.
I
That
don't,
was
I
like the
don't know.
center of all German civilization stuff. Okay, whatever. I'm forgetting the
Oh,
name.
I know what you're talking about. The one that got bombed and basically where like I know what you're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah,
Yeah, we
yeah.
will put the name up. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Either way, there were a lot of dynastic ties between Germany and Russia. They're complementary economies in the sense that Germany had like a military industrial prowess, and Russia had the vast resources and the vast amounts of people, peasant serfdom and stuff. So they were pretty much complementary in a lot of ways. Okay, like you said, it was the nightmare scenario for the British if these two guys got together because together they could totally challenge and probably destroy British dominance in Asia, in Europe, in the entire region. Complementary economies, dynastic ties, similar civilizational values at that time. I believe that, and this is kind of reflected in like this treaty, the reinsurance treaty. It was like a secret treaty made between Otto von Bismarck and Russia in like the late 1800s. I believe it was like 3 or 4 years, which was kind of like if either of us get into a war with another big power, right, we will stay benevolently neutral to each other. We're not going to get involved in each other's. And in return, Germany recognizes Russia's claims to Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, the claims to the Dardanelles and Constantinople, right? So they had kind of this quid pro quo, like, hey, listen, let's not get into fight. We have no reason to fight with each other. But they, once again, we'll talk about this later as we go on as well. There was a lot of British engineering to make sure that these two couldn't get along.
Mm.
There was a mutual, resonance between the German and the Russian aristocracies at
So
the time.
then, so this is the geopolitical angle,
Yeah.
right? So now it makes sense for you to want Tsarist Russia to be disabled, for the Tsar to be removed, and for a new regime to take its place.
Yeah.
Right? Going into it, their ties to the Bolsheviks, if they're clear, they must have known what they're getting into to
The
some
Bolsheviks.
extent, the British.
Yeah.
Because when, you know, the way the entire European aristocracy rose to say, crush the ideals of the French Revolution, whether in the form of grassroots movements or their embodiment in Napoleon.
Yeah.
Right? There was also a sense of caution when it came to communism.
Yeah.
Right? Because that was another threat that would erode their power.
Yeah.
So how is it that, like, I understand, you know, like, their interests align, so
Yeah.
they go against the Tsar, enemy of my enemy is my friend. But why would they why would they support the communists knowing that they could also become a threat for them?
See, so a lot of this, right? It was I don't think entirely that the British were sitting and planning the specific Bolshevik Revolution for like 20 years before it happened.
Okay.
It was just a great opportunity for them. And more likely than not, I feel like Lenin and a lot of the other, like, you know, main Bolsheviks were not necessarily British sellout. It was just the type of support they were getting at the time. You know?
So, a question.
Yeah.
Do you think so?
Trotsky
it
is
is
different. Trotsky was a British agent.
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah.
Okay. So, there's the aspect of, say, there's any kind of insurgency happening in the
Yeah.
world right now. Say
Yeah.
there's Kurdistan
Yeah.
right now, right? It is perfectly natural for countries that are geopolitical enemies of Iraq
Yeah.
or Turkey, or that benefit from their instability,
Yeah.
to co-opt or support,
Absolutely.
you know, the Peshmerga or whatever movement that is
Absolutely.
fighting in favor of Kurdistan.
Absolutely.
Right? That doesn't necessarily invalidate the movement for Kurdistan itself. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't.
And so the question then becomes, is it some kind of, is the support passive? Is it arms? Is it money? Is it ideological? And at what point does support become so overwhelming or so going both ways that the movement is compromised to the ultimate favor of the backer or the handler? So what I'm trying to get at is, so what the feeling I'm getting,
Yeah.
and just looking at like my rudimentary knowledge of the Bolshevik Revolution, is that the long-term consequences of the Bolshevik Revolution did not necessarily suit the British, but because in the short to medium term, it suited them that there's instability, that the Tsar falls, right? Because they didn't know that there was necessarily going to be a stable regime after. It suited them to support anyone who was going against the Tsar at that particular point. It didn't necessarily mean, like you said, that they engineered the Bolsheviks from the ground up and then made them come into power and they were all somehow...
It wasn't one big, massive, giant conspiracy,
Yeah.
but there was financial investment, industrial investment into the Bolsheviks in a way that is highly questionable. And there is a lot of reason to believe that Trotsky was just straight up a British agent.
You think so?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll get into it.
Okay.
So, in World War I, right? Let me go back a little bit. So, Germany and Russia kind of have like this good relationship with each other. Britain's kind of looking at Germany like, who are these upstarts who are kind of threatening our hegemony in Europe? Worst case scenario is if these guys in Russia, because they've had like 100 years of dealing with Russia in the Great Game in Asia, and now there's a rising German power as well that's threatening them in Europe, right? So their calculus is we need to neutralize both threats. If we help the Germans beat the Russians, suppose Germany has European hegemony. If the Russians beat the Germans and they come out stronger, then they have that Asian hegemony. The British did not want either of them to have hegemony in either Europe or in Asia. What happens in like 1907 is that Russia and England have this like Anglo-Russian entente, which is kind of like an agreement between them, which is saying that, listen, your colonial claims in Persia, they basically divided Persia up into three territories. The north belonged to the Russians, the south belonged to the British, the middle area up for grabs. And within this as well, the British did something very, very counterintuitive. They kind of recognize some of Russia's claims to Turkey. And that was the exact opposite of what the past 200 years of British foreign policy was. That doesn't make much sense. Why would they do that? That was the more heterodox reading on it was that the British never planned on upholding any of those recognitions of each other's sovereignty. It was a ruse. And once again, there's evidence to suggest it was. They were playing Russia. Why? Because if I have the Russians in this alliance with me, now they're not going to work with the Germans anymore. And our worst case scenario is kind of sorted. Because me, as the hegemon, I said, hey, listen, chill, 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 we can work together. Here's your land in Persia, here's your land in Turkey, but we're good. You and I are friends. If there's a war against Germany, you're going to fight with me. You get what I mean? Now, I mentioned earlier that the British were also playing the Ottomans against the Russians, right? The British might not have had to even make this alliance with Russia, but they had to because the Ottomans had aligned with Germany by this point. In World War I, the Ottomans and the Germans fought together, right? So for them, they kind of made this new thing where they never really planned on keeping, honoring these agreements, but they made them with Russia anyways. Now, I'll give you another example. In World War I, right, what's happening is that the Russians were unexpectedly weak in war, and the Turkish were unexpectedly strong in World War I. They got at war with each other. Another part of the World War I agreement was that if the Allies win, Russia gets the Dardanelles, Russia gets Constantinople, Russia gets all that stuff, Now for the British, once again, why would they agree to this? They spent the last 200 years making sure this doesn't happen, right? The Russians were unexpectedly weak in the war. They were getting battered by the Turkish. They request British help to fight Turkey as well. Now, the British were much stronger than Turks at this point. So they said, okay, fine, sure, we'll come, we'll fight you. We'll fight the Turkish on your behalf. This is called the Gallipoli campaign. And on the eve of the Gallipoli campaign, when the British finally got involved in it, they managed, the central area of Persia, I mentioned that it was up for grabs. They were like, okay, it's ours now. So that pretty much ensures British hegemony in Persia. 2/3 of Persia now, the south and the central, where the oil fields and everything were discovered, they belong to the British now. That's actually where when they established the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later became BP, British Petroleum, okay? So they go into this fight, they're going to support the Russians in this fight, There's this guy, some author, Broadbent, he's written 4 books about it, multiple articles about it. His entire thing is that the British deliberately pulled their punches against the Turks in that. Because if they beat the Turks, according to the treaty of the war,
Russians would
get it. They pulled their punches in the fight against the Turks. They said, you know what? It was like gross incompetence by the British that you would not expect to see. I think they lost like 47,000 soldiers or something. And the main purpose behind that was that you need to keep Russia in the war, because Russia was unexpectedly weak. You need to make sure Russia doesn't make a separate peace treaty with Germany, which the Germans were continuously offering them. Because if the Germans and the Russians come to peace, right, then your entire machination of, hey, let's make sure these guys never get together, right, it's gone. They need to keep Russia in the war. How do they keep Russia in the war? They say, yeah, sure, we'll get involved in Turkey for you.
But they don't fight properly.
They didn't fight it properly. And this isn't my claim, this isn't my speculation, there's plenty of authors who've written about it. They pull their punches in Turkey, make sure the Russians stay in the war, because then they can say, hey, look, we're fighting this for you, you stay in the war as well, right? For them, it was better to have the Ottomans in Russia, in Turkey, than to have Russian hegemony in the region. So there are multiple angles where, and once again now, where does the Bolshevik Revolution come into all of this, right? So the Tsar, the simple calculus in all of this would suggest that Russia is better off just making a peace with Germany, working with these guys, figuring it out, right? And the Tsar, I think, was tempted. A lot of accounts say that he was tempted to make this German peace. And then because you had this particular Bolshevik uprising and stuff as well, it's like, okay, if the Tsar makes peace with the Germans and stuff, the entire 200 years of game planning we've done to make sure these guys don't get together, make sure that Russian hegemony in Asia doesn't get too strong, it'll be all for nothing. And then opportunistically, they supported the Bolshevik Revolution. And at this point, Trotsky comes back. Trotsky was living in like New York at this time or something, typical transplant subversive. Trotsky was the original NGO, by the way. He was the original NGO cell sitting in New York. Trotsky gets stopped in Canada.
But literally, like, you can, there's, we get into this later in the episode, but there's a lot to suggest that there's a direct link between Trotskyism and the kind of international progressivism that
Yeah.
later became the whole NGO
Yeah,
racket.
neoliberals and neocons are both different sides of the same Trotskyist spectrum at the end of the day. Um, Trotsky's in New York, Bolshevik Revolution is about to break out. He's going all the way back to Russia. He gets stopped by British intelligence in Canada. Why would, if the Bolsheviks are your enemies, why would you let him go back? There comes a command from the US station chief of the MI6, some guy, William Wiseman. He's like, yeah, sure, you know what, go back. They cleared his path back to Russia. And then everything happens. Trotsky becomes the foreign commissar, the head of the foreign relations, and he is tasked with ending the war. He does not end the war, even though it would have been in Russia's interest to make a peace treaty with Germany. He, under the ideological cover of the evil czars, all secret treaties are annulled. Brother, part of that secret treaty was your claim to Persia and your claim to Turkey, right? Annul them. He's like, we do not honor any imperial or bourgeois treaties.
And just to clarify, those are his treaties with Britain.
Those,
which,
yeah.
which lends
No, he-
credence to your idea that Trotsky was compromised because he's pulled his claim from those hotly contested areas.
He pulled claims out of all treaties, including any secret treaties he might have with Germany or this or that. But the most consequential treaties for Britain are they have withdrawn all their claims out of Persia. That means there's pure British hegemony in Persia, and they've withdrawn all claims from Constantinople because those are all part of the treaties that they made with
Okay,
Britain.
you say
right?
this is the heterodox reading, right?
Yeah.
How does the mainstream explain this? Right? So to
Yeah.
me, if the Bolsheviks are my enemies and I'm an intelligence officer, and why am I clearing the way back?
Why? Because the Bolsheviks are not my enemy.
They know exactly.
Yeah,
That's
they're not
exactly.
my enemy.
But is there no popular accounting if this is a historically documented fact? Is there no popular accounting for this fact?
I think there is. There's a lot of authors who've written about it. Karen Quigley, Anthony Sutton, Guido Preprata. I've read a bunch of all of these. I read Conjuring Hitler, Guido Preprata, great book on this. There's a lot of historians who've documented this. The guy Broadbent I was talking about, who particularly specializes on the Gallipoli campaign, which was basically a British ruse. There's plenty of people who've documented this. There's plenty of people who've talked about this. The Princess Paley, who was part of the Tsar's family, has said that no, the British embassy in Petrograd was the hotbed of everything subversive, all the liberal subversion that was happening. They made a fool out of the rest of the royal family who were expecting Britain to enlighten them with a constitutional monarchy in their country, but it's like, nah, son, the Bolshevik Revolution.
Bro, you know what interests me
Yeah.
is that yes, intelligence apparatuses got a lot more sophisticated post World War II, and they got a lot more official. But spyfare has always been real, right? And if today you live in a world where you know constantly whether it's Pakistan not being able to take its full advantage of its ports,
Yeah.
right? You know there's some foreign intelligence involvement there in sabotaging us,
yeah, obviously,
right?
yeah.
The same thing, and this applies to any country that a global or regional power wants to compromise.
Yeah.
All of these things are real.
Yeah.
You accede to this fact that intelligence and behind the scenes conflicting interests have this outsized role in determining real outcomes
Yeah.
in geopolitics,
Yeah.
right? At the same time, you also acknowledge things like this platitude that history is written by the victors,
Yeah.
right? So in this matrix of supposed self-awareness about history, about geopolitics,
Yeah.
right, there seems to be in the mainstream remarkably little accounting for the intelligence,
Yeah.
for the subversion, and for the hidden layer of machinations happening underneath the surface during World War I, World War II,
Yeah.
right? That doesn't automatically mean that every heterodox reading is correct.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
but it does cast a long shadow on the idea that the fully mainstream accounts cannot be questioned.
Look, history is written by the winners, right? The mainstream history is going to be written by the winner. This does not position the British in very, very good light. David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of England at the time, was notoriously anti-Bolshevik. The Secretary of War, some guy, Anthony Kitchener, I think his name was, once again, notoriously, and not anti-Bolshevik, anti-Russian. There was reason for a lot of these guys. On the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, goes to Parliament and he says, we now welcome the USSR into the fraternity of democratic, liberalized, enlightened countries, you know? So there's a lot to suggest that they were involved in a lot of this stuff. The ideological layer comes in because socialism, as like this elite flavored ideology, actually finds its roots in Britain more than it does in a lot of other in France and in Britain. You know, so Alfred Milner, who was the secretary, I think he was not a secretary of war, but he was part of the five-man war cabinet. He's one of David Lloyd George's top guys. One of the Kerensky, who became the premier of the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution, even called him the evil genius of Russia, right? This guy in his youth was a socialist. You know, there were a lot of these guys, Arnold Toynbee, Alfred Milner, who did have ideological sympathies with with socialism, and they did want to go out of their way to engineer this. This is all there, by the way. They were part of this thing called the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society has actually given most of the British Prime Minister. Keir Starmer part of the Fabian Society as
So
well.
isn't that funny? Like
Yeah.
a lot of people get mad when they hear you say socialism as an elite flavored ideology.
It always
But
has been.
there's a very direct link to be found
Yeah.
in that being true.
I mean, a part of Milner's writing, or it was Toynbee's writing, they explicitly state that, you know, the socialism is a great unison between the upper classes and the lower classes. The only people who are going to oppose it are the reactionary middle classes, you know? So it was very much an aristocratic idea that, hey, listen, let's give the lower classes socialism so that they don't have our heads. And the only people who are going to be opposed to it are like the actual working middle, you know? These are their words about it. So once again, most of it was a geopolitical calculus that Britain played brilliantly, but there was also ideological sympathizing with the socialist cause uh, within a lot of the British elites. Alfred Milner, Arnold Toynbee,
You know,
a
you
lot of
see
these
this
guys.
flavoring in Pakistan as well.
Yeah,
So the progressives, and we've had like a progressive writers association and certain organized groups. And if you look at major figures, I think I think Manto was the son of a judge. I think Kurtala and Heather was from a very aristocratic family.
yeah,
Uh, Her major rival was always criticizing her for being insufficiently. I'm not one of those people who invalidates, who makes this weird kind of ad hominem attack or this personal attack, saying that just because you come from a certain background, you can't have certain beliefs.
absolutely.
That's
No,
not
that's not the
the idea at all. Like, you know, I think universalisms are the best isms, right? You should be able to believe what you want despite your background. But it is interesting that some of the most prominent advocates and the most self-righteous advocates for these causes often do not live those lives. So it's one thing to, for example, say that I was born into a wealthy family. So, but now that I'm a socialist, I'm going to give up all the trappings of wealth,
Yeah,
right? That's admirable.
yeah,
But so going back to the Kurtala and Heather example, she was criticized for having very bourgeois leanings or concerns in her literature
yeah,
because you know, sometimes she's parodying the upper classes or writing about their more emotional concerns rather than giving class analysis. Her critics were often also aristocrat adjacent individuals, right? And they would be mad about her not writing or looking at everything through the prism of class analysis, but they themselves, uh, being well off, never degraded their own lifestyle, right? That choice you have,
yeah.
then to live outside of the dark aspect of property relations is a choice that you then have,
Yeah.
right? And I'm not making the lazy argument, which is that, oh, you're a socialist, why do you have an iPhone? Like, I'm not making that
No,
argument,
yeah.
right? But I'm making the kind of argument which is like, okay, in a serious way,
Yeah.
if you are a socialist, but you have the freedom today to not participate in the oppressive form of property relations,
Yeah.
then in order to be principally consistent and preach that, right, then you should participate in the positive form of property relations, which is that, you know, then don't own much. Like, there has to be some
Here's the thing, even
balance.
if you look at like the original vanguard of the Bolshevik Revolution, right? Most of them come from like some sort of aristocratic or at least wealthy backgrounds.
Yeah.
You know, Trotsky wasn't some.
They're at the very
Yeah.
least upper middle class. The parents were like influential
Yeah, at least
academics or
bourgeoisie.
judges or something. Yeah.
Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was like the head of the secret police, the Cheka, who killed 100, 200. He was the biggest ideologue of the entire Bolshevik Revolution. came from a noble Polish family. Lev Kamenev, another one of these big time Bolshevik guys, came from an aristocratic family. Trotsky wasn't exactly aristocratic, but he came from money. He wasn't some. I mean, he lived over half the world. He lived in France. He lived in England. He lived in Mexico. He lived in New York. He's all over the place. He particularly hated the Russian peasantry because he thought them to be backwards and anti-Semitic, and he hated the Russian peasantry. He thought that any type of Bolshevik revolution has to come from the working class. The
But that's a
industrial
pretty
working class.
consistent Bolshevik thing, though. That's not just
No,
Trotsky,
no. Lenin and the original Bolshevik
Yeah, no,
party.
not him, but I'm saying that's a common strain of Bolshevism. That's not just isolated to Trotsky.
It's not isolated to Trotsky, but compared to the rest of the Bolsheviks who were like, hey, listen, let's get the peasants up to speed as well.
Yeah.
Like one of the main things that Lenin wanted to do was like, hey, listen, peasants, no more feudalism, you can buy your own lands. He's kind of supported a little bit of capitalism in the countryside. Because Russia was decimated after the war, right? He's like, okay, how do we rebuild our industry? And so some sort of controlled capitalism where the peasants could buy their own land and could, tinker in the free market. Lenin supported it. He's like, we need these guys to get up.
Were those like the kulaks or something?
No, that's later. That's
I'm remember. I've done like O-level history, so that's what I remember.
yeah. That's the I'm not talking about that.
Okay.
I'm talking more about Lenin. Lenin wasn't some sort of like anti-peasant type figure. Trotsky was an explicitly anti-peasant type. It should be a dictatorship of the proletariat, not the dictatorship of the proletariat and the rural peasantry. So he really didn't like them, right? So coming back to it, the socialism as this elite favored ideology, it was kind of true in the Bolshevik Revolution as well. Stalin actually did not come from a background like that as much, and that's why you later see Stalin as accused of all these reactionary ills, even though, like, objectively speaking, Stalin at the end of the day was a patriot at the very least. I think in Russian national mythology, nobody thinks about Trotsky and great Marxist theory. They think about Stalin destroying the Germans in World War II, right? National myth making. So Stalin actually touched grass. Trotsky, yeah. We'll get into this later. Right?
So, we've been discussing how the British played a role. What exactly was that role, and how were the Americans also involved in it?
Okay, so in regards to the revolution, we've kind of set the stage of what Britain's goals in Russia were, what they wanted out of Russia. Britain's goals, based on my reading, were primarily intelligence based. They was about creating subversion. It was about, having a lot of the, key revolutionary figures like Trotsky under their thumb in a lot of ways. So their goal, from what I gather, was more related to intelligence matters. The Americans, first thing is that you need to kind of view the American establishment at this point and the British establishment at this point as essentially behaving as one. It was Carroll Quigley, who's a very, very well acclaimed historian, who called them the Anglo-American establishment. And he was particularly referring to this period of time.
And something that persists to this day in a big way.
Yes. They were behaving as one. The financial angle of the revolution, of overthrowing the Tsar, it came from the Americans. Wall Street was involved. There's another book on this, The Bolshevik Revolution and Wall Street. That's the name of the book. It's by Anthony Sutton. It's another interesting book, okay? If you find some inaccuracies in my telling, you're free to read that. I can give you all my citations, okay? So, the Americans had a hand in financing the revolution. Jacob Schiff, who was the head of Kuhn Loeb and Co., which was one of the top banks in America and the world at the time, he's on record of having given $20 million to overthrow the Tsar for some sort of change. He was also a very, very virulent Zionist, and he did not like the anti-Semitic, treatment of the Jews, especially by the Russian peasantry and the Tsar. So he was kind of fighting for, Jewish betterment as well.
And it also
he's quoted on saying this.
It also makes sense that ideologically it aligns here more, because it makes sense that he's trying to fund a social democratic opposition against the Tsar.
Yeah.
And chate na chate way, he ends up accomplishing something else, which is the Bolsheviks taking over.
Yeah.
And what you can kind of argue is that ultimately all the people or any international establishment that was trying to strengthen social democrats or Mensheviks or whatever you want to call them, and trying to use them as a foil against the Tsar, and hindsight is 2020, but you could make the case that uh, it should have been on their radar that the more extreme factions often win out.
Yep.
So,
But see, the extreme faction winning out, see, the British always had a very, very strong sense of pragmatism in the way they operated. They're like, okay, we don't mind the Ottomans continuing their rule over Constantinople as long as the Russians don't get it, right? Their main goals were accomplished by the overthrowing of the Tsar, which was Tsarist claim to Persia, Tsarist claim to Constantinople, and Tsarist potential alliance with Germany. They accomplished those three goals. The rest, it doesn't matter. The rest is business as usual, right? They'll work with the Bolsheviks, they'll work with the Mensheviks, they'll work with anyone. You know, William Boyce Thompson, who was on the Federal Reserve Directory in the summer of 1917 under the pretense of the Red Cross Society, goes to Russia with like 15, 16 Wall Street financiers, attorneys, write a nice check for the Russian Social Democratic Party. Why? Of course, there is some subversion going on in all of this, right? We already documented Jacob Schiff's involvement in it. Jacob Schiff also had a particular ideological element to it, given the bad treatment of Jewish peoples in Tsarist Russia.
and you see this
And
split.
the fact that, and one more thing, the fact that a lot of the original Bolsheviks were ethnically Jewish also helps. Lev Kamenev was Jewish. Leon Trotsky was Jewish.
So this is
a lot of them, I believe even Stalin's grandmother or from somewhere, he would also had like Jewish inheritance.
This split
Yeah.
never leaves the USSR.
Yeah.
Because in the latter day,
Yeah.
one of the major splits between Stalin and Trotsky also comes down to Zionism.
Yeah.
Right? And you see the more social democratic and more, we're against totalitarianism altogether, the more activist, the more permanent revolution, self-righteous wing of the party
Yeah.
is committed to exporting, is more social democratic, it's more Zionist,
Yeah.
and the more authoritarian part, which is the more Stalin wing, stays.
Based on my reading, and Stalin and Lenin always argued about this, like two brothers, like, no, I'm carrying Lenin's inheritance. No, I'm carrying Lenin's inheritance. In my
Stalin
reading,
and Trotsky.
Stalin and Trotsky,
Yeah.
yeah. Who's carrying Lenin's inheritance? Both believed them to be so. I found Stalin to be more carrying of that legacy, particularly because of the peasant question as well. Trotsky was not interested in the peasant question. Trotsky was not interested in developing Russia in any way possible. His main thing was, I need to get the revolution to the developed world. That was his main thing. Lenin did not necessarily see it like this. Lenin thought this was kind of stupid. Trotsky wanted to unite the entire like working class of all of the European countries. He wanted to kind of make a proto-EU where there's an entire continent of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He called it the United States of Europe. And Lenin's like, bro, have you lost your mind? Like, they will be a superpower. They will oppress the shit out of all of us. We do not want all of them. Imagine like middle of 1910, 1920s. It's like, yeah, Germany, France, and the US, and the UK, the three most powerful countries in the world at the time, like, yeah, you know what? We're all one big country now. So Lenin's like, we do not want this, you know? So based upon the more nationalistic elements of it that Lenin had, even the more pragmatic reading he had of, hey, listen, control capitalism in certain places, especially rural places. We'll nationalize the banks. We'll nationalize electrical, businesses, things like this. This belongs to the party. But a lot of these other things, let's get the average person involved. Stalin continued these policies as well.
Okay.
Right? So from my perspective, like rhetoric aside, the policies of Lenin, including the new economic policy, which was like, a break from the war communism that would basically nationalize, war machine, everything, was continued on by Stalin later on.
Okay. So now that we've established that there was some level of involvement
Yeah.
by foreign intelligence, by Wall Street money
Yeah.
in the February Revolution of 1917,
Yeah.
whether it was to the Mensheviks or the Bolsheviks, there was involvement, right?
The main thing was, let's get the Tsar out.
Yeah, let's get the Tsar out. Now, once the USSR has been formed and the government's come into place,
Yeah.
right? There'll be a lot of people who say that, look, they didn't actually follow they didn't actually necessarily fund the Bolsheviks. So how could you say that that they're behind them or that there's some conspiracy? The next, what you'd have to then contend with is what you were mentioning earlier, that a large part of the USSR's industrial base was built up in coordination with or through investment from
The
figures
US
like Henry Ford or
The Rockefeller Chase Bank established the Russian American Chamber of Commerce. You know,
but
yeah.
the way I look at that
The one
is
bank that was not nationalized, by the way, was like a bank that had links to JP Morgan.
so.
There were
Now
things.
the way I look at that is, for example,
Yeah.
right? The reason I wouldn't see any conspiracy there
Yeah.
is because when I look at the U.S. and China today, for example,
Yeah.
or when in the 60s, the US and China had their first diplomatic breakthrough, and then eventually China is let into the international system, World Bank. They're led into the system of international trade.
Yeah.
Someone could look back at that and say that actually ये दोनों तो पूरे time मिले हुए थे, and there's actually a conspiracy, and the US and China are not really opposed, and it's an international financier class or whatever,
Yeah.
right? But at some point, it becomes a pragmatic decision within the life of great powers
Yeah.
to say that, to accept that the other side is a reality that's not going away.
Yeah.
Like the US could only ignore China for so long,
Yeah.
and we need to open up markets and trade with them.
Yeah.
So, do you think that there was some kind of conspiratorial support in building up the USSR, or the Bolshevik administration in the USSR by these American financiers who invested later? Or do you think that it was just a natural, business as usual, we have to tap this market?
It's both. Like I said, most geopolitics comes down to key goals. The key goals were accomplished. Overthrowing the Tsar accomplished all your key goals. You've set into this idea. You've also gotten the Slavic people addicted to this international revolutionary ideology that would kind of make them reprehensible to the more capitalist, Germanic, old conservative, younger class elites, right? You've kind of ensured that these guys can't be friends. So all your worst case scenarios have kind of been taken care of. There's no German-Russian rapprochement possible. How can Germany, which was a more capitalist, more aristocratic society, ever accept these guys? The average German would be like, no, why the would I? This is what enables the rise of Nazism also, because Nazism comes as a reaction to a lot of the socialist extremities, right? Even in Weimar Republic and stuff, it was these liberal tendencies that were kind of synonymous with a lot of the socialist stuff that they came as a reaction to, right? So you've kind of ensured that they're not going to be friends. You've ensured that they're not getting involved in Turkey, and you've ensured that they're not getting involved in Persia, right? So you've kind of have them stuck in a place. You've got your guy then at that time, that was Trotsky. Trotsky was their guy. Trotsky eventually got beaten out by Stalin. But Stalin, even by that point, was playing ball with them. Stalin was like, hey, listen, we can work together, invest your money here. We want to industrialize. You can make money here. You can have control over some of my oil fields. Help me industrialize. And they were good with Stalin for a long time. They were good with Stalin until after World War II. In World War II, Stalin was their buddy. Stalin was amazing. Their falling out with Stalin particularly happened on the Zionist question later on, right? So up until that point, Stalin was one of the Stalin, FDR, Churchill. It was like the big three, bro.
Yeah.
Those
Potsdam pictures are like aura.
It was the big three.
Yeah.
How does this guy who you've positioned as, now we're not talking about history, now we're talking about like the cultural aspect of things. How is this guy that you've positioned as, equivalent to FDR and Churchill, who are the leaders of the free world, now he's a bad guy? Why? How does this all happen? A lot of reading guy, it was a question of Zionism. He did. And Stalin also initially, he supported Zionism. He helped he helped arm a lot of the Israeli settlers.
I don't know that.
He did,
Okay.
yeah. The falling apart came when a lot of those guys, I mean, it's not conspiratorial to say that, Jewish people have had a lot of influence and continue having a lot of influence, especially in high politics, high finance, high industry, and all these things. But when the Israeli government chose a clear side, which was the Americans, right? That's when they started having a problem. And then he disrecognized Israel. The Soviet Union was the first country to recognize Israel. But when Israel chose the American side, they unrecognized him.
Interesting.
Stalin and all the original Bolsheviks, I mean, the USSR government at the time, they started supporting the Arab nationalist movements, Arab communist movements. PLO. Like later on, Stalin's successor, spiritual successor was Brezhnev. Brezhnev was a big supporter of the PLO. What's happening here? So the fall apart with Stalin also, it really happened on the question of Zionism. I'm not saying that Stalin didn't have his excesses. He did. Obviously, all of them did. Stalin's calculation was like, yeah, I'm gonna have to be this big brother type figure, thought policing. There was, I think they had an art movement called like Soviet realism or Bolshevik realism, where it's like every art must be there to glorify the great leader, the great. So I'm not saying he was some saint, but whatever you want to say, there was a Russian nationalist tendency
In Stalin.
in Stalin. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
And-
I understand that, and that's why he becomes so at odds with Trotsky later.
Yeah.
And I believe one of the criticisms that people had of Stalin was that he's still trying to create architecture and art that has some beauty in it.
Yeah.
Which I find insane.
I think here's the thing. When the revolution was happening, these are all Bolshevik. They were all far left. Like let's bring the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie down to earth. But once you're in power, you have to get into nation building, and nation building inevitably requires some degree of conservatism, some degree of hierarchy, some degree of reactionary metrics. These are rules that you can't.
And even art and beauty that inspires, like
Yeah.
you need to give people something to look forward to or look up at.
Yeah. Stalin's calculus was, I need to industrialize. I want to do socialism in one country, exporting the permanent revolution. And this was really, really like abhorrent to the Trotskyites. It's like the entire basis of socialism, the original Marxist theory is we need to spread it to the developed world. Socialism is only possible, the communist revolution is only possible in a developed country because you have enough riches and materials to, divide between the populace. But Russia just wasn't that rich at that time. So Stalin's thing was like socialism in one country, let's get international investment to develop. I don't think Stalin was part of like some big, Western conspiracy. My opinion is Trotsky was. I don't think the Bolshevik Revolution in its entirety was. I don't think Lenin was. But the overthrowing of the Tsar was definitely in the Anglo-American establishment.
So, okay, so as much as I've looked into it,
Yeah.
the reason I don't, the reason the Trotsky being a agent
Yeah.
does not resonate with me immediately is because even when he's in exile, he's writing in defense of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
In the sense that he says the Soviet Union now requires a political revolution, but not a social revolution.
Yeah.
And what he means by that is the new property relations established in 1917 that did take private property away from property away from private ownership is the correct way for things to be organized, but the bureaucratic collectivism or that new concentration of power is what he wants to fight against.
Yeah.
So he says that political revolution needs to be made to change our administrative class, but the Soviet Union as it exists, its overall structure of property relations is the correct one, and which is why he ultimately concluded that he did not want to support any action against the Soviet Union as a whole because he felt that it was ultimately reformable.
Yeah,
right?
he thought it was a degenerated worker state.
Yeah. So
That's what he called it. And he wasn't like a Soviet hawk. Yes,
I'm not necessarily invalidating what you're saying, but from what I've read, which is what came later, right? This is what my exposure to the Trotsky side has been. However, and the post-Trotskyists that abandoned the method of dialectical realism, right? Because this was the entire thing that Trotsky said that, look, and not to get too Hegelian, but a Hegelian concept is that, like, for example, you look at an acorn, right? An acorn, the concept of an acorn or the concept of, is everything from its development from nothingness to when it turns into a tree or whatever, right? So from start to finish is the process rather than a static moment. And that was the thing. Trotsky held the position ultimately, like you said, that this is a degenerated worker state, but this is something that carries a kernel of truth within it, and it is in the process of fixing itself, right?
But I think there's a big part of it, like he's still defending the USSR as an entity, as like, hey, listen, we don't have to go, like, we don't have to destroy them. I think a big part of it was that he wanted to find a way back into power. How many times do we see, like, uh, you know, exiled rulers? They're not saying that I want you to destroy my old country. It's like, hey, they just need reform. Who's the guy for the reform? Me, of course. You know what I mean? This is a recurring theme in a lot of developing countries. How many times have our leaders gone into exile? And they're not saying that, hey, listen, we need to destroy Pakistan. It's like Pakistan
Yeah.
is in a bad state and we need to reform it. Who can reform it? Me, of course. Trotsky was the second most powerful. I mean, he was the most powerful man in the Bolshevik Revolution.
But
He was the guy who, like, look, Raza Pahlavi is not going around saying you need to destroy Iran. He's saying we need to reform Iran and I'm your job for it, guy for it, right?
Yes. No, but the reason I keep coming back to it, and
Yeah.
at that point is taken,
Yeah.
right? That's a serious objection. But at the same time, does Trotsky's version, because Trotsky is not a social democrat at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
His theory
Yeah.
by the Fourth International and after is not Menshevik in its version of property relations,
Yeah.
right? It is hardcore communist, and that is something that he outrightly defends till the very end,
Yes.
right? Taking that into account, his version of permanent revolution, uncorrupted by later Trotskyists, still has a character that is internationally progressive and wants to spread.
Yeah.
Because it views a threat to communism anywhere as a threat to communism at home, right? And its ultimate system of property relations is not something that the US or the UK or any kingdom or social democratic state would want.
Not true though, because once again, I want to get back to Alfred Milner, who was the most influential British statesman at the time. I don't know if you've heard of the Milner Round Table Group and stuff.
No, I
like these guys are like the archetypes of the Illuminati. Like they were just sitting and deciding everything. But Alfred Milner, like I said, in his youth, you know what he was advocating for? Liberal imperialism. What is liberal imperialism? Let's use the British Empire to establish democracy all over the world and enlighten values, enlighten despotism in a way. That is synonymous with neoconism. These guys were talking about it 100, 150 years before neoconism was even a thing. It's totally synonymous with what even Trotsky was talking about. Liberal imperialism and permanent revolution, exporting these values to the developed world, and once it's in the developed world, in the rest of the developing world, right? These are pretty these are ideas that were thoroughly established in the Anglo-Indian
there's
at that
a
time.
complication there.
Yeah.
No. One,
even
the
in
thing
the-
is, look,
yeah.
this connection does not answer my ultimate question
is
of
he
the
an agent?
difference between, because there's a difference between the property relations that exist in a social democratic country
Yeah.
and that exist in a socialist country, that exists in a communist country.
Yeah.
Right? What I'm saying is that yes, there were groups in the United Kingdom, in the US, and all over the world that had social democratic leanings, right? But Trotsky, till the end, did not support that social democratic system of property relations. He supported an explicitly communistic one. And later, the journey from Trotskyism to neoconism is something that can be traced,
Yeah.
but it's not a one-to-one thing.
It isn't,
Right?
it
So
isn't, yeah.
that's what I say. There's key elements of Trotskyism which
Yeah.
he stuck to till the end of his life that they had to abandon in order to get to
Neoconism.
neoconism.
I don't disagree
right?
with that.
And also to get to the neoliberalism and that
Absolutely.
element, right?
Yeah.
I'm asking because you're talking about Trotsky in particular,
Yeah.
right? Like again, right? There can be a confounding factor here that we don't know about because ultimately we're talking about intelligence apparatus and there's never clarity there.
Yeah.
If really Trotsky was an agent and he was trying to come back to the USSR and take over, the most common thing in the world is for people to take over government and then not do what they said.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm not saying this is some what you're saying is not possible.
Yeah.
Right? All I'm saying is that
I'm not saying it in like, this is beyond a kernel of a doubt. I'm just saying, based upon a lot of Trotsky's moves, based upon his personal life of living in these places, based upon him being caught by MI6 in Canada and then being given safe passage to go inflict this Bolshevik Revolution against the Tsarists, who happened to be the UK's allies in World War I as well, right? Makes you pause and think, what's happening?
absolutely, which is why I take this supposition seriously.
The first thing he does once he becomes a commissar of foreign relations or whatever is
The treaties.
undo all these secret treaties.
So
All these
then the
secret
question
treaties
becomes-
that the USSR made, the Russia made with Britain, were their control in Persia and Turkey. Now you have
So
a
then
bad
the
in both
question
of those.
becomes, the
Yeah.
question becomes,
Yeah.
does that necessarily mean he's an agent, or
Is he a useful idiot?
is he useful idiot? Because look,
Either
all of
way,
these things,
you know.
all of these things. No, no, but it's important, right? It's
Yeah.
important because either all of the things that you've mentioned, even including the pulling out of the treaties, are possible under the anti-totalitarian Trotskyian spirit, right? Because look, on the one hand, if you're an intelligence agent,
Yeah.
right, and you know Trotsky's particular leanings, right, it could be a case of if your enemy is doing something stupid, let it happen,
बिल्कुल,
right?
ठीक है.
And also, even more than that, it could be if there's some sort of ideological alignment, or
Yeah.
there's something that Trotsky is advocating for that suits the West,
Yeah.
that suits the spread of a certain kind of international progressivism,
Yeah.
let it happen.
Yeah.
Right? So, and there's a journey from kindred spirits to useful idiot to being co-opted, being an asset to an agent.
Yeah.
Right? There's a big
There were
spectrum.
also accounts where in the supposed sham trials, there probably were sham trials, the Stalin sham trials. Like a lot of people testified against Trotsky, saying that there was this one particular guy who, I'm forgetting his name, but he said like I was being blackmailed by British intelligence on Trotsky's command. There are instances of this stuff as well. Once again, there was the Princess Paley stuff that wasn't necessarily aimed at Trotsky, but did allude to British involvement.
So look, my
So,
case is
my-
not
my-
that he
no,
wasn't or that he was.
And I'm not even saying
Yeah,
that he is necessarily, like I said, without a kernel of a doubt, an agent. I'm saying at worst he is a useful idiot. At best he's a useful idiot. But if he's a useful idiot, right, I don't necessarily find his intellectual work to be taken very, very seriously. Because either way, the forms of it that are to
Taken
be
seriously by who?
taken seriously by a lot of Marxist theorists.
Okay.
Because at the very least, if he was actually advocating for those things, he lost to Stalin. Number one, and number two, if he wasn't if he was just a subversive, a British agent, then you can't accept what this guy is saying, right?
What do really hardcore Marxists generally think about this?
Man, they're not one hegemonic thought process. Stalinists don't like him. He's got his Trotsky's trendy. Trotsky's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The Trotskyites, the left Trotskyites, end up supporting a lot of this deconstructionist art, critical race theory, and stuff. That's where you'll find the Trotsky support. Right?
Yeah.
I'm obviously not going to like it.
Yeah.
You're probably not going to like it
Yeah,
as well,
no,
right?
no,
So
that's
once
lame.
again, I don't have to call him an agent to still say that, bro, a lot of the stuff that you talked about did not have intellectual merit. Like I
No,
can
absolutely.
still see,
And
I
that
still see
residue-
yeah, I still see intellectual merit in a lot of stuff that Lenin talked about. Because Lenin was the other
Yeah.
core intellectual. I get. Because Lenin was also like, here's the thing: there's one thing between theory and there's one thing between practice, right? Praxis.
Yeah.
Lenin still had a pragmatic element to, yeah, okay, theory matters, but we gotta do stuff as well.
And
We just-
Stalin maxed out the praxis part.
yeah, Stalin was not an ideologue. Stalin cared about, can we get shit done? And between pure theory gooning and let's just get shit done, I will always support the guy who's like, let's just get shit done. Do you get what I mean?
He had a
That's where I land.
kind of principled realism where in broad strokes he's heading towards something similar, right? He's trying to give the end product, the service delivery of the USSR, mimics or is close to what Lenin envisioned. And I'm new to the entire Marxist theory thing, so anyone can correct me on this.
Give you an example of
But
this.
yeah, as opposed to the whole Trotskyist thing, where the strain of Trotskyism that evolved into liberalism and then started accommodating the critical race theory and whatnot, has now become the fashionable thing in the West, and the identity politics strain. And obviously, you can't fully attribute this to Trotsky. It's not his fault, but there is a strain of thinking that there is a line, there's a thread of commonality there. That particular line of thinking has basically dominated and relegated class analysis to a secondary position.
Absolutely.
In today's new liberals that think they're leftists.
Yeah, neoliberals, neocons, the same side of the same coin. Just an
Even
example-
social democrats, even the AOC types, right, who self-identify as social democrats, the identity politics thing often still class analysis plays second fiddle to identity politics.
Absolutely, yeah. So even in terms of another reason why I think theoretically Trotskyism was like war communism. During the war, They nationalize everything, nationalize the land. Everyone go work in the factory so that we can build this war machine. The war is over. Trotsky is still advocating for war communism. Why? Because we need to build more shit. We need to make all the peasants go into the factories and work because we need to spread the revolution westwards. We need to continue the permanent revolution, you know? Lenin is like, no. Stalin is like, really, really no. You know? Socialism in one country came as a response to Trotsky's insistence on continuing war communism, which was just like, you know, it was also totalitarian in its own right, you know? Let's just send everyone to the factories so that we can spread the revolution where it matters, which is the West. And once the Western worker, the Western proletariat takes over, then he will assist us in USSR.
So, getting into Trotskyism in particular, the three defining features were, one was a permanent revolution, internally and internationally. Two, the philosophical commitment to dialectical materialism.
Yep.
And three, Vanguardism, the idea that there would be a vanguard or a certain group that
An inner
intellectually led the party and the
Yeah.
people to their communistic salvation.
Yeah,
Right?
like there's a vanguard, they're the protectors of the
They're
proletariat.
the protectors of the
You know, the
proletariat.
rulers of the proletariat,
Proletariat
they're
is the protectors, yeah.
Okay.
And the reason I felt like we needed to give this textbook definition before
Yeah.
we embark on Trotskyism and post-Trotskyism and how they relate to neoliberalism and neoconservatism is that there was what Trotsky professed, what he actually believed in, and then what was dropped from those core tenets in order for them to mutate into neoconservatism, into neoliberalism,
Yeah.
right? Because yes, Trotsky's thought enabled those things to form,
Yeah.
but that does not mean that Trotsky was responsible for exactly that formation of thought,
No, yeah,
right?
of course.
So the first split that arrives within the Soviet Union is with Shotman,
Yeah.
right?
That's in New York later on. Max Schachtman is in New York.
Yeah, but what I mean is
in the
ideological
view
fracture.
towards the
the
USSR.
ideological fracture.
Okay,
yeah.
that's sorry.
No, I
Yeah.
didn't phrase it clearly.
Yeah,
But the idea there being that Trotsky charged Shotman with giving in to bourgeois American ideas and refusing to see the Soviet state as a process, right?
Yeah.
So there emerged a bureaucratic class in those years within the Soviet Union under Stalin.
Bureaucratic collectivism.
Stalin's bureaucratic collectivism, they called it, where what were supposed to be managers and just your comrades who had slightly more responsibility were now exercising an outsized influence to the point that where it looked like, they owned the asset.
Yeah, the aristocratic elite was replaced by the bureaucratic elite.
And maybe they weren't going to inherit it, and maybe they weren't going to have it for the entirety of their lifetimes,
Yeah.
but they derived a disproportionate amount of power, an oligarchic kind of power,
Yeah.
by being in functional control of major state entities, assets, and policy.
This is very, very relatable to anyone living in Pakistan.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
if you have the seat, particular seat, particular ministry, whatever, it's like it's not your inheritance, and you're not going to pass it down to your kids. But at 5-6 years, you sit on that seat, you can really make yourself rich.
This particularly applies to strong bureaucracies all across the globe, right? It's a natural feature of bureaucracies.
Yeah.
And we can get into later how a concentration of power is a natural feature of any system, but just staying on topic for the moment, his charge was that you've been charmed by American empiricism, and you're like trying to taxonomically approach the Soviet Union and saying that actually this is not a worker state because the managerial class, the bureaucrats hold an outsized amount of power.
Yeah.
Trotsky actually defends against this. He defends the USSR against this charge and says that you cannot view it as a static snapshot that this is what the USSR is, but the USSR is truly a transitional phenomenon that is in that dialectical process to becoming a true worker state. So it is not simply a state run by bureaucrats. It is a state that is run by bureaucrats, but it also has the correct kind of property relations. It also has certain ideas of equality enshrined in it that did not exist before. So he says you have to view this in a complete manner, and he repeatedly reiterates his commitment to Marx and Hegel's dialectic,
Yeah.
right? Whereas on the other side, Shortman's telling him that look,
They kind of see they kind of position themselves as like, there's the excesses of the far left, which is kind of what you're kind of seeing. Shatman and the neocons, the proto neocons, in a way, they're looking at the Soviet Union and seeing like this is the dangers of the pure far left, and they really don't like fascism as well. Like fascism is the main bad guy, and this is also turning into this new class of bad guy where the socialists don't only stand for opposing capitalism. They don't only stand for opposing fascism, but they're also opposed to this third kind, this third enemy, which is bureaucratic collectivism.
No, Shortman's critique is all encompassing in the sense that he doesn't make taxonomies that, oh, I'm opposed to this and this and this. It's a more general attitude that I'm anti-totalitarian.
Yeah.
Right? And that anywhere totalitarianism gains ground, I'm going to oppose it.
Yeah.
Right? Which is what forms the kind of mental persuasion which starts out as I'm going to be anti-totalitarian, and then it turns into the Soviet Union is the embodiment of totalitarianism, and therefore, even though I started out as a leftist intellectual, I'm going to end up supporting the Vietnam War, right? And I mean, later on, there's all sorts of these endowments and these magazines, which are obviously backed by American intelligence, and the National Endowment for Democracy in particular, that becomes, a breeding ground for war hawkism. That all of these people in this post-Trotsky ecosystem begin to support.
Yeah.
But the point being that, people who have this, a particular kind of subversive mentality are very easy to co-opt, right? If you're a contrarian, if you're in it for, I'm just opposing the powers that be, and I don't have much of a positive vision, right? And because the USSR, as it is right now, is not perfect, I'm going to let the CIA tell me what to do.
Yeah.
Right? It's very easy. That journey is completed in an easy way.
To give Trotsky the benefit of the doubt here, ultimately, he still lived. He still has a lived experience in the USSR. He's not just speaking from theory. He has a practical lived experience over there. I'm sure he has some emotional attachment to that place as well. It's his country at the end of the day. He did the greatest works of his life over there. He lived a life that, that was pretty cool. At the end of the day, like, if you're Trotsky, if you're this cool guy who's going to like military camps and putting on like motivational shows for your soldiers, he used to do this.
I don't know.
Yeah, he used to like, they would have like deserters on the edge of execution, and his train would pull up right on time. And right when he pulled up, he would stop the execution. He would give them this amazing speech and why they should continue fighting for the revolution. He'd take out like a gold watch. He's like, now I'm going to give one of the people in the crowd a gold watch, and they would get all pumped and stuff. Like Trotsky lived a cool life. So, and this was all in the USSR. So I understand he has like a soft spot. He has a lived practical experience where his word on it matters more than these like these neocon, these proto neocon war hawks like Max Shatman, there's Irving Kristol, there's a lot of these guys, So yeah. Going back to what you were saying.
No, but yeah, it's this it's an interesting scenario where so this is one end, right, which turns into this social democrat, still left-leaning idea where it leaks into something later, which is like the theory of this idea that they could realign within the Democratic Party. The ultimate bending the knee that the Shortman type of progressive does is he says that, look, right now we've got northern progressives and the southern segregationists in the same party, in the Democratic Party. But if we maneuver the right way, we can bring our social democratic left-leaning strain into alignment with the northern progressives, and we can kick the southern segregationists out.
Yeah.
Right? And that alignment will smuggle in genuine progressivism into the Democratic Party, and one of the two big parties in the United States will then be a truly social democratic left-leaning party.
Yeah.
Right? That was the idea.
Yeah.
That's what it started out as. That was the initial idealism.
Yeah.
But by the time they become meaningful within the movement, that base of workers, of intellectuals that initially supported the Shortman wing, erodes from underneath him, right? The
They turn
post-war.
into the new left. Like during the Vietnam War and stuff, this is like, you're talking about this era,
No,
right? When
I'm
they turn
talking
into the
about
new
I'm
left.
talking about specifically how a lot of the working class,
Yeah.
because of post-war prosperity, becomes richer, moves out to the suburbs, gets some nice things, and says we don't want to be in this unionist working class movement anymore,
Okay,
right?
in that sense.
Or
Okay.
that people who were younger and idealistic eventually outgrow their Ivy League idealism and fantasies,
Yeah.
and say that even though we were, stalwarts of this workers' movement, I'm getting a job at a good law firm now. JP Morgan Chase wants me because I have 140 IQ and they want me to invent the derivative. So I'm gonna get I'm essentially
lot
gonna
of those
abandon the
intellectuals
cause,
grew out
right?
of it, yeah.
You see this, man. You see this, like, this is not that exact same era, obviously, but like, have you ever seen Don Lemon? There's this recording of him when he was very young. He's giving the most impassioned defense of the working class and like the most left coded speech you'll ever see. And he's way younger. And you look at the guy now, he's like, as mainstream media slop co-opted by the establishment as it gets. Right?
Yeah.
He'll have certain strains of, and in fact, it's like you're going from it's very loosely kind of like a Stalinism to Trotskyism, post-Trotskyism journey. Because initially you were this guy who was like, willing to get into some trouble for the working class, and now you're on like CNN and all you care about is like the identity politics thing. But he's one guy who it kind of shines through sometimes that he has like that kind of background, but ultimately does not have the fervor for the movement or that strain of movement that he did when he was younger.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's
Fast forwarding a bit, just on the links of like neoconism and Trotskyism, I think that they're really, really aligned. Like, look, they keep neoconism. It's not the same as Trotskyism, but it keeps the structure while changing the content of it. In the sense that both are very, very pro interventionism. Let's export this revolutionary ideology. One says it's socialism. One sense says it's liberal democracy. Most of these neocons, right? They were originally Trotskyite, James Burnham, Max Chapman, Irving Kristol. All these guys become like the godfathers of the neocon movement. From my reading, told me that the main tipping point of where the neocon as its own full-fledged movement, aleda from the Trotskyites, aleda from like the democratic left, it happened in the 60s because of the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
when a lot of like the new left was like the hippies. They opposed war, they opposed American interventionism, they opposed the Vietnam War, they really opposed Israel as well.
Yeah.
All these things really pissed the neocons off, and I think this is also important to note that a lot of those original neocons were Jews. Irving Kristol was a Jew.
And they're committed Zionists.
They were committed Zionists, exactly, yeah. So they found this to be the moral bankruptcy that was seeping into the new left. Is like, you're not even committed to these values of democracy and liberal democracy, and we've established
So,
this one neo-Sparta like country in the middle of the Middle East, in the middle of all these regressive backwards people who stand for those democratic values. So that's kind of where the neocons kind of come at it from, and where they get started, and where they kind of separate entirely from Trotskyism, but still keeping that structural permanent revolution thing.
I want to caveat this by saying that there's criticism of the idea that the neocons are a post-Trotskyist offshoot in a big way. And let me tell you what the critics say first. Right? So a lot of the critics will argue that this is the same kind of that America, far predating the Trotskyism or post-Trotskyism seeping into the American people's framework, had a brand of missionary fervor, of spreading American values, far preceding that, whether it was through Christian missionaries, whether it was the Four Freedoms or Wilson's 14 Points. A lot of people have argued that the neocons were a continuation of that Wilsonian tradition of
manifest destiny, let's spread our values,
spreading our values,
spread our
right?
commerce. Yeah.
So However, that does not mean
Yeah.
that the post-Trotskyist alignment was not a real thing.
Look, while there is some truth to that, there's also always been a trait of Americanism, which is like pretty explicitly anti-intervention. Like America famously did not get involved in the world wars
Yeah.
much until the very, very end. They were not interested in like getting involved. One of the main conditions they told Britain, like, we will get involved with you, we will help you out, but you have to give up your colonial empire. There was a strain of anti-interventionism that's always been there, implicit, imminent to American politics as well, right? So both things have kind of existed. Did the neocons really, really tap into American exceptionalism and told them it's your like messianic uh, goal to spread these values? Yes, and that's why you can see that they co-opted like the evangelical movement for these goals as well.
No, for sure. And I think that the first thing you said, which was that this strain has always existed, which is why it's perfectly reasonable to argue that the post-Trotskyist relationship to neoconservatism latched onto that strain.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, that strain always existed. That doesn't mean the Trotskyist influence was not a factor. Right?
Yeah.
Definitely was a factor.
I'll give you another very, very practical example of Christopher Hitchens, right? New atheism dork. He literally says, in my youth, I was a Trotskyist, and he was one of the most fervent supporters of the Iraq War as well. The Iraq War is like peak neocon moment. You know what I mean?
Isn't that Peter Hitchens?
Christopher Hitchens.
Because I saw a video yesterday of Peter Hitchens saying exactly that.
Maybe Christopher Hitchens, one of the new atheists.
No, I know Peter. I actually got confused when I saw the video because I was like, he's like, oh, I'm Peter Hitchens and I'm saying this. I was like, who's Peter Hitchens?
Yeah, I'm not sure what Peter Hitchens. I'm talking about Christopher.
Okay.
I'm not sure who Peter Hitchens is. So once again, like there is a lot of ideological overlap. Irving Kristol, he was called the godfather of it. He broke with the Republic, with the Democrat Party and the New Left, particularly on the Israel matter, the anti-Israel matter that was coming in the New Left in like 1973 during the Yom Kippur War and stuff. So, and once again, it's important to note that Trotsky was also about Zionist. Let's not forget that angle as well. Trotsky himself was a Jew as well, right? So the common theme running in a lot of these guys is there's a religious aspect to it.
No, for sure.
I'm not saying I don't necessarily. I think it's too much to say like they were like subversive towards all these things because of their ethnicities, but that did play a role in the political positions they ended up taking.
No, look, the thing is, we don't even have to necessarily look at it from a purely what was your ethnicity lens,
of course not.
Right?
Yeah.
If you functionally and vocally supported Zionism, which was the political angle of the split, that's more what we need to get at, you know?
And the fact that they just happen to be Jews as well,
Yeah.
it adds like there's a personal
Yeah, I mean,
level
look,
to all
look
of this.
today, the reason, a lot of people will say that, the reason even today the Zionism-Jew distinction is made, and the reason it's useful is because Christian Zionism is such a massive phenomenon.
It's arguably stronger than
Right? In pure numbers, there are more Christian Zionists in probably like 2 states in America than there are Jews in the entire world. Right?
Yeah.
So that phenomenon, that's why it becomes important to talk about it in terms of Zionism as opposed to a purely ethnic phenomenon.
Yeah.
Right? And obviously there's obviously a relationship there, but
I mean, there was a lot of intellect. I mean, people like to cast the neocons as this like totally brain dead boomer ideology, which it is a boomer ideology, but the foundations of neoconism, like you have some heavyweight thinkers behind it. Like if you want to count Trotsky, sure, but Leo Strauss, and one of the greatest political thinkers ever, like Leo Strauss is credited a lot with pioneering the neocon movement himself, right?
So, and the switch that I find to neoconservatism, which I find particularly interesting, is Burnham.
Managerial Revolution wala, na?
Huh?
The guy
Managerial Revolution. Bro, but his particular approach of this through, like, he wrote a book called The Machiavellians, right?
Yeah.
And he had like, basically he's arguing the Pareto distribution, which is that, dude, no matter what kind of system you set up, no matter how egalitarian it looks on a superficial level, power will also concentrate there, right? So even if you create like a like a commune and there's 50 people and they all vote on every single decision always,
Yeah.
right? If you allow some kind of free dialogue, there will be 2 or 3 or 4 people among them who emerge as leaders, right?
Yeah.
That will always happen,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
like to do this, to establish this as a logical basis for you don't have to have a complicated political theory. You just have to have existed in human society at any point or place in time.
Yeah.
Right. So the point there being that
and even funny thing is, like, even a guy like Trotsky kind of finds this implicit. He just likes to. These guys are
the
semantic
Vanguardism.
The Vanguardism.
Yeah.
These guys are kings of semantics, by the way.
Yeah.
They're just playing language games half the time. Like, can we get down to what you're talking about? And it's just like, no, but this. It's like shut. Like,
that's actually one of the issues that he had with Shotman was he was like, he raised this question, Shotman. He said that, look, if you're saying that the bureaucratic collectivism, the strong bureaucrats that now run the USSR under Stalin, are actually they form a new class.
Yeah,
right?
more class oppressors. Yeah.
Right. If this is a new class, then because you're a Marxist who says that class is determined by property relations, what difference in property relations did this new managerial class bring? Because there was no difference in property relations, that means that this is not a new class, right? Which is ultimately the problem with the one-dimensionality of Marxism. So Shotman couldn't give an adequate response at the time because he was still clinging on to a Marxist framework to some extent, right? Anyone outside it would just say, man, property relations are not the only factor. That's the real answer, right? So then you're trying to sneak Vanguardism into it, which is essentially the same thing. And you have to make this argument to Shotman about property relations only, because then it allows you to make the Vanguardism argument, right? It allows you to say that it's not really a new class or a privileged class because property relations, who owns what, stays the same, even though the vanguards of the party are exercising an outsized intellectual or administrative influence, right? And that ultimately, to anyone who has actually like served a day in an organization, anyone who owns a factory or anything, will know that, dude, think about it this way, right? And we get into this in detail, but today, any big listed company on the stock exchange, right, which is owned in like packets of 20%, 10%, then, a million small owners, right, which don't have big controlling stakes, right, and who have professional boards, their CEOs are often incredibly powerful, right? To ignore that altogether and say that ultimately, because ownership lies somewhere, the managerial class does not have power, does not constitute a new confounding class that puts my old one-dimensional view of property relations into disarray, is just it's and like someone this I'm open to correction on if I'm missing anything in the Marxist framework, because I'm still very much new to this. But I found this to be on the face of it initial inconsistency.